Kyle and I were married 14 years and 3/4 of a year, almost to the day. And but we're still married, right? That's the whole point of this whole video. We are still a family.
That's right. Where were you married?
Idaho Falls Temple. My parents had never been through the temple, and Kyle's mother wasn't very well, so we decided that would be a better place to do it rather than Mesa. I met him the third day I was at what's called BYU Hawaii now, but was Church College of Hawaii at the time in 1962. And they were having an off-campus preschool dance. And I was at the dance and having a lovely time, and unbeknownst to me, my husband wanted to ask me to dance, but I was occupied. And so at the intermission, we girls got up from our place where we were sitting and went over to get refreshments. And as we left our seats, Kyle and all of his friends took our spot. And I was the first to get my refreshment. And as I started back across the dance floor, I looked up and here's all these guys sitting where we were. And I was like, oh, this is embarrassing. Do I keep going? Or do I go ahead and take one of those empty seats, you know? And so anyway, luck would have it for me that as I sat down, it was next to Kyle. It was one of the empty seats. And of course, all the guys kind of tittered, and I'm like, oh, this is really embarrassing. And so the typical question ensued that always does when you meet somebody at school, well, where do you come from? You know, and of course, my husband would say that I never stopped talking after that as I told him about wonderful Arizona. And actually, the way things flowed for the rest of the evening, all of a sudden they were announcing that it was the last dance. And we both looked at each other and we're like, what? A whole half of a dance had elapsed and we weren't even aware of it because we were so caught up in each other and who we were. And so anyway, he's like, well, would you like to dance the last dance? And so as I stood up, again, we had a surprise. As we both looked at each other, and we're like, oh, okay, so I'm a little bit taller than you are. So that was another little 1-inch surprise. And from there, things just progressed.
All right, so from that first night, or that first dance, were you like hand in glove, or things progress, or what?
Yeah, kind of. The thing you have to understand is I had a missionary. The reason I had gone to Hawaii, we both had gone to Hawaii for interesting reasons. Kyle had gone there to change his lifestyle and to start anew, and his brother and wife were there at Pearl Harbor, and so there was family there for support. And so, of course, I didn't know any of that when I first met him. And I had a missionary out, and he was coming home the next summer, and so I was kind of like, I want one last big fling, I want a big trip. And so I really owe a lot to my father for making that happen for me, because I was at BYU Provo at the time. And when I told my parents I wanted to do this, my mother was, in those days, people just didn't travel far distances like that. And she really didn't want me to go. And my dad never bought Christmas presents. My mother always did the shopping. But that Christmas before I went, my dad put underneath the tree an envelope that said, this is a ticket to Hawaii to school. And so that was how I got there. And so I still had that missionary, but I kind of waited. You know, there was a lot of water under the bridge. I'd kept his scrapbook for his mission. I knew his folks. They'd visit me at BYU when I was there. Every conference, his dad was in the bishopric, and he'd come down from Oregon and visit me. And so I'd been to his farewell and played the piano, and you know, there's a lot of water under the bridge there. So I did wait. I mean, all through the school year, though, I kept telling myself, you know, I really think I love this guy, told my parents, and of course initially they thought he was Polynesian and they flipped out. So you don't do telephone calls in my day. They were way too expensive. So it was just by letter, and I never did say he was Caucasian, right? So they would think I'd met some Polynesian over there, and so they were real concerned about that. But anyway, I ended up waiting, telling Kyle that I just really had to see Jerry when he came home. So I went up. As I stepped off the plane in Boise, it was one of those where you go down the steps and you go across the runway. And I saw him in the distance. And I almost turned around and got back on the plane because that was kind of my answer right there. Without even talking to him, I saw him and I went, what am I doing here? And I kept telling myself, okay, give yourself time. You got to get to know him again, really make a wise decision, especially with my parents' unhappiness and in their marriage. I was very concerned. I'd prayed for like 6 years before I met Kyle, actually. Like a nightly prayer that I would meet the right person for me, that would be the kind of father I wanted in my home and have the church an important part of my home. And so anyway, we kind of played around over the summer, phone calls. I made another trip. I went to see Kyle's family for the first time, which was quite a revelation because he wasn't even there. He got stuck. He was working for the Forest Service, and they were supposed to pick him up off a mountain, and they never did. And so I spent the first weekend up in Idaho Falls before summer school started at BYU with his family. I didn't even know. So I learned a whole lot, though, about the kind of family, and I was very impressed. And so we did make contact, another trip up there, and it really kind of solidified. And I know Kyle thought I was a little, wishy-washy, and so he gave me a deadline. He says, October 1st, I want an answer. So.
Which was how long?
It was summer, and I was going to summer school, and so I saw him once during that time period, and then we were both going to be at BYU that fall. Oh, we love to have fun. I take life much more seriously, maybe just because the way I was, I lived through a lot of things that weren't happy times. And so it was nice to have somebody who just enjoyed life so much and had so much fun with it. And he was good looking. He was very good looking, and he was very spiritual. And he was very tender, and he made me feel like I was the most beautiful thing in the world. And he really did sweep me off my feet, and he really knew how to tease. We went together, I don't know how many weeks, even could have been a couple months before he ever even kissed me. Oh, yes. He was, yes. And he laughed about it afterward, that he was really giving me a run for my money. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was a dynamic leader. He was a friend to everyone. It was just everything that I wanted, and he knew what he wanted out of life, and that was the one thing I couldn't find in this missionary. I kept thinking, okay, he'll go on his mission and he'll come home and he'll be this dynamo. He'll know what he wants to do, take the world by storm. I wanted that kind of thing, and he didn't. He came back and he still didn't know what he wanted to do. And even when he got engaged the same year that I got married, his fiance called me up and wanted to know, tell me more about him, because I can't get right. He says, you're the only one that really understands him. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, and you're going to marry this guy? Of course they didn't. Their marriage didn't last. I found out years and years later that it didn't. She ran off with some salesman. But yeah, literally. So, but I mean, Kyle knew what he wanted out of life, and we both were very determined about what we wanted out of life and what we wanted our children to have. We had the same goals, even though many people said we were so different, and we were. I mean, our interests were different, our personalities were very different, but we both respected so much. And I mean, we used to talk a lot about, our kids are going to have the best of both worlds. They're going to have the best of each of us. And we really respected what each other's strong points were. Okay.
What did he tell you?
I don't know. Okay, I'm organized and I love kids and let's see. I love family opportunities.
You're good with the kids.
I'm good with the kids, yeah, and I'm smart. And I mean, education was always a really important thing in our family. All my relatives from way back are all teachers, and right, so was always a real important thing.
So in rearing the children, you took the spearhead on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we kind of had a joke about that. I mean, he said, okay, now you take care of them when they're young and you guide them and so forth, and then when they get to be teenagers, then I'm going to take over. And I was like, that's totally fine with me. And of course, that's where I think that Kristen felt so bad, because she'd heard us joke about that. And of course, she was 11 and 3/4 years old, just getting ready to go into Young Women's when Kyle died. And I mean, she had gone on little outings whenever Kyle could bring her. So she'd already had a taste of how much fun it was going to be with Dad being, even though he was in the bishopric, he was over the youth. And that was really a hard thing for her. Well, there was probably hardly a day that he didn't tell me that he loved me. And he always had surprises. He loved to do surprises. And so, I mean, he'd walk in the door and he'd say, okay, gather everybody up, we're going. And we'd all be, where are we going? And you'll know when we get there, And I mean, he just loved to do, I mean, life was exciting. That's why it was so hard to adjust to him not being here, because life was always so exciting with him. You just never knew. I mean, that's why he was considered the life of every party, because he made it that way for us as a family, too. He'd bring home flowers, and it would be no special occasion. It was just, he'd just bring home stuff, and surprises. And I mean, we knew. I mean, there was no doubt how much he loved me. I don't know if the story would be appropriate to tell at this point. After he died, the one I had told you about, where I was outside the Relief Society room, and there was a bunch of ladies. I don't know how many months afterward it was, and they were talking about how much they miss Kyle. And I came up on the conversation and just stood there listening to them. And then one of the sisters said, oh, I bet this really sounds strange for us to be talking about how much we miss your husband when he was your husband. And then another lady said, the reason why we could love your husband so much and we could miss him so openly is because there was never any doubt in anyone's mind what kind of relationship the two of you shared. And I guess it's kind of like what John Draper just recently, a month ago or something, who was a very good friend and our financial advisor for all this time, had said that we had a kind of synergy that you don't usually see among couples, where we could be so engrossed in one another as we traveled to the temple one night with taking our motorhome and a whole bunch of people. And John and his wife Betty commented how, with the motorhome full of everyone talking, it was like no one was there for the two of us as we sat in the front just talking about the day, or whatever we were talking about. but we were so engrossed in one another. And that's the one thing we really did have. We had a great communication. We really knew how to communicate. After Brian and Kristen were married, Brian asked me one time, he says, I told Kristen that she probably doesn't really remember because she was too young, but she said she never heard her parents ever argue or fight with one another. And I told her she probably just doesn't remember. And I said, no, that's not right, Brian. She's correct. We never did. And we had something very, very special. We never had any major blow-ups as we were dating or after. Um, well, it was really interesting to me this summer with my sister and I finding the history at my Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lorraine's home of one of our ancestors, Elsina Peterson, which would be like a great back there, right? That she too was a widow with 4 children and was told by her husband in a dream to take the children to Arizona to have them raised, which is a whole nother story. But in that story that is told about her, her children too, answered that same, wondered why didn't their mom ever remarry, when she had these 4 children. And she too felt, which I thought was just uncanny, the same type of thing that I felt, that it's not that I'm not married anymore. I'm still married, and I never felt that there, I needed to. I mean, I felt like that the hand of the Lord was part of all this, and that if I really needed to get married again, that the opportunity would come my way. And that answer really came to me as I read Jacob Hamblin's life history a few years after my husband's death. And he was left with 4 children to cross the plains from Nauvoo when his wife wouldn't go any farther with him to Salt Lake. And he really questioned when our ancestor, baby Lyman, wouldn't adjust to the cow's milk, whether he should go back or keep going. And he really questioned it. And he had a dream that when he got to Council Bluffs, there was going to be a white picket fence as he would come into town, and he was to stop at that house because there was a widow there that he should ask to marry him, and her name was Rachel. And when he drove in, he saw that, and she already had had the same dream. She already had her trunk packed. And I mean, this was made into a play in Salt Lake years later, this story. And so when he came to the door and said, I'm Jacob Hamblin, I've been impressed to come to your door, she says, I know, I've been waiting for you. And she says, there's one thing you have to know is just as Rachel of old couldn't have children because she'd been married before and hadn't been able to have children, she says, I haven't been able to bear children, and you need to know that. And he looked at her and said, just as Rachel of old had children, you'll have children. And she had like 3 or 4. And so anyway, when I read that story, it was kind of like a little direct answer to me that if my ancestor, who was such a great prominent person in the church, Jacob Hamblin, if he could have the faith that, if there was a need that it would be provided, I just felt like that would happen for me too. Kyle was real concerned about 2 young men who didn't want to go on youth conference, namely Kurt Stidham and Randy Knight. And so he said, okay, what can I do to get you to go? And they're like, oh, we love to scuba dive or whatever. Well, no one else was really doing that. And Kyle had done scuba diving over in Hawaii, which we never could really prove, but anyway, he had done like a little class down in Kaneohe or something, because I remember it, but we couldn't find the stuff, which would have made a difference in the lawsuit. But anyway, so he went ahead and actually Kurt Stidham went and rented the gear and got all the equipment from Black Bart. And so that was the reason why he was out in the water, was to be there with those young men so they would go on the youth conference. And of course, it changed their lives forever. And they've become wonderful They became Eagle Scouts, which I was there for that. They went on missions, I was there for that. I was there for the wedding, both weddings of Kurt's, because his wife died. And he called me after his wife died. So that's why he died, because he loved those youth so much. And I know it was hard after he died, because he was supposed to come home earlier for that last night. And Bishop Berger said that he was just so excited about what he could see happening in the lives of not just those two, but other youth that, and he said after they had a big kickoff party on Friday night over at Bishop Berger's house. And so after the kickoff party, Kyle stayed there and was visiting with President Berger about, all the youth and what we can see happening. And he was just so enthusiastic. So being 6 months pregnant at the time, I was fast asleep when he got home, right? Which was, definitely sad to me that I didn't have that time, but Saturdays were really hard when Kyle wasn't there, because Saturday was our family day. It had been that for years. Kirk would count when he was a little boy, how many days till Saturday? Because that was the day we always went and did things. So I was not looking forward to Saturday because he wasn't going to be around, right? But that day was really a very peaceful, perfect day. I remember sitting, just as clear as a bell, sitting on the front doorstep. And it was March 17th, right? Now, why in the world I would be doing my bills for April, I have no idea. I really wasn't that organized. But for some reason, I was doing my bills already. And, or at least my budget. I was doing something with the bills, because I can remember sitting there watching the kids playing out on the grass, and it was just, nobody was fighting and arguing, or, everything was just going along just so lovely. It was just a lovely, peaceful afternoon. And I guess because, it was March and it was starting to get a little bit warmer, the sun felt so beautifully warm. And of course, he died about 2 in the afternoon, and about 5-ish, President Berger was able to get a little plane and get himself over to, because the police were just going to call me on the phone and tell me. And President Berger was like, no way are you going to just call and tell her that. And so he got a plane and got over here. And I knew when I saw him standing on the doorstep, I didn't know what had happened, but I knew he was gone. There had been no reason for him to be standing there. And all I could say was, Kyle, I can't do this. I cannot do this. And I felt like I couldn't. I really, truly felt like I couldn't do it. And because a lot of people said, Kyle was such a dominant personality that, when you looked at our family, that's who you zeroed in on, was him. And which was perfectly fine for me. And I had always had to be so, I always had to take the initiative to go to church on my own, to go to seminary on my own, to be the strong person myself on my own. And so I had reveled in those almost 15 years of having a strong person lead us out. So it was just overwhelming to me to think that I was going to have to do this by myself. And of course, being pregnant doesn't help you, right? To feel a little overwhelmed at 6 months pregnant. But, ever since then, it hasn't stopped, right? Us feeling that, at first feeling myself personally overwhelmed, but then as the months, the weeks, the months, the years went on, and we felt the ripple effect of his life on other people, and then they in turn became a support system for us. It was at a point, I remember once Kristen saying that, if we needed anything, all we had to do was think or pray about it, and somebody would be there. I mean, that was the point it was for my kids, because, I mean, at first, you just think it's kindnesses and, which I'm sure it was. But when things just kept happening and in our life to support us, and people had their own personal experiences, then we came to realize that maybe we as a family have a special role to play in this whole experience. Because of the kind of life that Kyle lived, we had a responsibility to be there too for other people and be an example and be a strength wherever we could. And I think that's one of the lessons that we learned not too long afterward when things kept happening in that. I must have had, yeah, kind of. I think I had somebody very young, maybe it was Karina or Kent, on me at that very beginning point, and when I was just sobbing and hysterical. And I mean, I wasn't hysterical, but I was, you know. And then the kids were still outside, I think. And so then there was a point, I mean, President Berger will probably remember all this much more than I will. There was a point that he went and gathered all the kids. And I remember us having prayer. He's going to be able to tell you better exactly, exactly what happened. And we had Kyle's cousin and wife were here real quick. The Bowdens were here real quick. She was my visiting teacher. And then my dear Aunt Ferneth, I mentioned to her about this. Once I called my parents, my dad called my Aunt Ferneth, who lives in San Bernardino, and of course she's elderly. I mean, she was then, and she's like, because it was nighttime, she came and stayed with me the first night. And she says it was a miracle to her, because she'd only been to our house once. And she says, it was truly a miracle that I found your house and that I could be there for you, And another miracle was that I slept that night. I slept. I mean, to me, it was just like, it was a miracle, I mean, what I was going to have to face, that I had that comforter there so strongly that I could sleep that night. And, a funny thing with that, too, is when Kyle used to go on business trips a lot, because, he was like secretary or treasurer for the whole state association for contractors, for installation contractors. And so he would, have overnight trips and stuff where he'd go to meetings and stuff. And I would just be paranoid about him being gone. And I had this huge knife. I mean, really huge. And I would put it under my pillow because I was just so freaked out about being alone. And I couldn't sleep, and I'd wake up, and oh my gosh. And it wasn't until, months later, all of a sudden I realized I never ever thought again. I never have since then thought about being freaked out about being alone or needing protection under my pillow or anything, because I have felt so at peace. And like I say, that came that very first night. Oh yeah, sure, definitely. In fact, when Kent, quite a few years ago, I was joking to him about, finding a wife, which he still hasn't done. Well, maybe he will. Maybe he has. Yeah, bleep that out. He was going to go work at the ranch, and his comment to me was, "Well, Mom, I got to find somebody as strong as you are." And I'm like, "Kent, no, 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 no." And so I had him take my journal that I had kept real closely the first couple years. Actually, I've been reading through it up till I think like 1985, really. I kept it, but I really, the first year or two, really wrote a lot because it was very therapeutic. But I wanted him to read it because the mother that he remembers, of course, because he was only 3 when Kyle died, is not the mother I was then, And I wanted him to realize that we grow line by line, step by step. And, some days I felt like I was stepping back, like 10 steps instead of 10 steps forward. And I had my hard days. But, the thing that I would say to Mother Hess was, what do I want more than anything else? I want to be with him again. And what kind of promise do I have if I blow it down here? This is kind of my test, right? I mean, everybody has their tests, and there's some people's tests I certainly wouldn't want. So this is the one I've been given. So, I've got to do the best I can with it. And yeah, I still to this day miss him horribly. But what good is it going to do me to just sit around and mope about it? And I had these 5 kids to raise. I mean, someday, I kind of, I told, Mother has this, I said, someday I'm going to have to face not only Heavenly Father, but him too. And I'm going to have to account for the way I raised our children. And so that was a real motivator to me. It was kind of like, how they say, what would Jesus do? I was like, and what will Kyle do in this circumstance, right? Patience. Before we closed the casket, Kristen and Kirk and I were the last ones there to do that. And I told them that I wanted them to each make a promise to their dad, something that they felt they could promise him. And so my promise was to try and be patient forever with the children, with myself, with what I was going to have to endure. And so that was really kind of the hardest thing I had to learn, because I'm not always as patient as I would like to be.
What's your greatest hope now?
For my kids to be all happy, and you could come to understand Heavenly Father's plan a little better, I think, the older you get as a parent. As much as I would like to take away and shape everything up and make things easy for my kids, that's not always the best thing for them. And, it's hard sometimes to stand back and watch and be patient, which is, the hard thing. Well, I'm working hard on that right now. I'm working on the slides and the family history, and I'm doing a whole bunch of things to hopefully that will be a way that I can be remembered, that, will be an accurate account, right? Because it'll all be in black and white, so to speak. Probably, I really wasn't looking for so much an experience for myself so much. Maybe that's why I really hadn't ever been there before, because if I felt like there was something I could have really drawn from it for strength myself, I would have gone there, sooner than 25 years later, right? And so it was not something I really felt like I really was doing for me. It was more something I wanted to have my kids experience. And of course, Kirk and Kristen had already been there because of youth conferences, so they'd already had a little bit, but I felt like I wanted the younger 3. I just felt like it was one of those things I felt like I wanted the children to have that experience. And since I had never heard Kurt Stidham's telling about the experience, it was special to have him, do that so that we could hear that. As I think back on just the general things that happened after Kyle died, I mean, there were people who wrote poems, one who said he was a Paul Bunyan to everyone. And so there were all these poems that came in. There were people who named their children after him. We have several Kylies and Kyles out there who were named after him. And we have, of course, a scrapbook full of letters that were given to us over the years, telling the children about their father. And they kept coming in, and even to the point of 26 years later, with one that came near the anniversary last year of a family who the husband worked for Kyle for only 3 months. And in her letter, she read this wonderful quote where it says, "If a man can bridge the gap between life and death, if he can live after he's died, maybe then he was a great man. Immortality is really the only true success," said Derek Marlowe. And then she went on to say in her letter how much she and her husband had used Kyle as an example in talks that they'd given in church and lessons they had taught throughout the years, and that he was, said some people are successful in all areas of their life. Some excel as good husbands, some as good fathers, some as sons or friends, but Kyle Hess was all of that to everyone he knew, even though it was only 3 or 4 months that we got to know him. The impact of his spirit will live on forever in our minds. He knew what to do, how to do it, and then he did it. And those were just, the impact of people seemed to not end. And people had dreams that he came to them, and some of them were teenagers, some of them were missionaries, some were adults. All of these are recorded in my journal that, of course, we don't have time to dwell on at this point. There were people who saw him in the temple who were not even family members. My journal is, I feel, is kind of a book of miracles. At first, when I wrote them down, I thought, well, those are kind of nice, and they were just isolated coincidences that happened to our family. But when they kept happening over and over again, it became obvious that it was more than just a coincidence, that something very special was happening not only to us as a family, but to those that we had the privilege of associating with. As I've been going through my journal, and I've only covered like a year and a half or 2 years after he died, there were some statements that I thought were kind of interesting ones that I wanted to kind of just mention. I marked down, people keep telling me what an inspiration I am to them. I know that I've grown a lot this year for sure, but is this all for the rest of my life that I will experience? My childhood happiness was so fleeting, and then I strived and prayed for the right partner to share my life with, and a pure joy of a celestial type came, and now it is gone. I marked down that even if we don't believe a word of all the experiences that people have told us or believe them, these people believe them. And they say this says a lot about the kind of man that Kyle Hess was and is. A sister called me on the phone about church business, and near the end of the conversation, she broke down crying. I was surprised, not knowing why she was crying, when she said that I had truly made her day faceable now. I don't know what it was I said, but it seemed our conversation made a difference. She said she could just feel my absence in church last Sunday when I was gone. I came to realize maybe at that point that perhaps I had a purpose here deeper than just raising my children. There were comments that went on. I felt again several months later that I perhaps had a responsibility beyond what I had visualized would be my life. Let's see, what was another one? Oh, we went on a survival camp up in the Tetons, sponsored by Rick's College. And it was one where the mother, well, in my case, all the rest were fathers, would at night learn survival skills for your family out in the wilderness. And I mean, Cammie was only 1, so that gives you an idea how young my family was. And then during the day, we were supposed to go out in the wilds and practice these skills with our family. Well, at the last meeting that they had a testimony meeting. And it was really quite shocking to myself and to the children that more than half of the testimonies all dwelled on us as a family. And I think that was another enlightening moment to me personally, because these people didn't know my husband. So it wasn't a reflection of Kyle that people were doing things or viewing us or thinking about us. These were people who did not know my husband. And I again felt that responsibility that we as a family had a role to play that maybe was beyond what we ever thought, of not just surviving what this might be a test for us. Another thing that I found, let's see, where was it? About a year and a half later, I laid in bed one fast Sunday feeling like, this is what I said, I was thinking that the time of great miracles had probably come to an end, and that all these months of things that had happened in our lives were now just for us to remember the strength and the assurance they gave us. And it was time now not to expect anything more out of the ordinary. And it was a time for us to go on and move on and be strong. Well, that very same sacrament meeting, a mother of one of the teenagers stood up and bore her testimony and mentioned how thankful she was for leaders like Kyle Hess, who gave everything to make a difference in the lives of teenagers. And then again, I was set back that we, as a family, were still being remembered. Another fast Sunday, a couple of months later, a brother I didn't even know stood and bore his testimony and how thankful he was for people like the Hess family who are modern day pioneers. He offered after church meeting to come over and fix anything I needed repair whenever I needed it. I'm trying to be of good cheer. I know Kyle's helping me, for I've been more even-tempered than I've ever been in my whole entire life. So as the days went by, again, I felt a real sense of that I had a role to play, that there was a reason why this all happened to us as a family. And I came to understand, as I wrote here, I have found that if each day I tried to think of someone outside my family and do a little act of love, my life seems so much better. And that was some really good advice that I got after Kyle died, when I felt so overwhelmed. Someone said to me, you know, I know that you feel like there's not much you can do for others, but even a smile will make a difference. And that really was true. Being that I was raised with parents who weren't married in the temple, and all my relatives were, and I saw what they had that I didn't have growing up, that was probably the reason why, you know, I prayed for like 6 years straight that I'd be led to the right person at the right time for me. And so eternal marriage was a goal that I had for a very long time. It wasn't something I took for granted because it was just part of the family scene. It was something that I desired greatly. And probably that's why it's been so hard to go on without him, because I relied so much on that kind of marriage that we had and the depth of it. But because of that, that too has given me great hope, and I feel like has given me a strength that some people don't have, because I know what I want, and I've been very determined that that's what I'm going to have, I hope. And it's been a great blessing in my life, and you know, something that I've emphasized with the children a lot, that we were an eternal family. We had so many people who had experiences with Kyle after his death. You might wonder how I would have felt about that. again, it was a testimony that he lives. And I guess I kind of went back to a family story on his side of a great-grandfather who came back to his wife. She had asked him to before he died. She knew he was dying. She said, "You've got to come back and tell me you're okay." Well, he didn't come back for several years. And she was very grieving. And when he finally did come back, which is recorded not only to her, but all the children saw him also. And it's Kyle's grandfather who saw him. She asked him, "Why didn't you come back? I asked you to come back and tell me you were okay." And he said to her that because she was grieving so much, she couldn't have stood it. And I thought about that a lot because I thought, it would be too hard to let go a second time. I just don't know that I could have done that. It was hard enough one time to do it a second time. I don't know if I'd been strong enough to do it again. And I'm sure that's why we had all these other people around us who had those spiritual experiences to tell us that he lives and that there is an afterlife and that we will be together again. And that was a great testimony to me. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, definitely one of my first questions will be, and why did I have to do this? And hopefully, I think as time has gone on, I've come to understand a little better, maybe, that I had a lot of growing to do. And this was kind of my test. And it's kind of like the little thistles, that picture that I have upstairs, that one day Kyle brought me home some thistles out in the field on one of his job sites that he thought were so beautiful. And a couple of years later, I found a framed print that had that same picture of a thistle all ready to just fly away with its seeds, and then a beautiful pink one that was in bloom, not ripe yet. And to me, that really symbolized us, the two of us, because he was ready to move on. He'd proved himself. He had done everything that he needed to do here in this life, and I was left here to still blossom some more. And it will definitely be, I hope, a very, very special reunion, and that I will feel just like when I face Heavenly Father and Jesus someday, that I did my best. I think that's what will make it rewarding, is that I did my best, and that my kids always knew how much I loved them, how much their father loved them from afar. And if I accomplish that, then it's going to be great. How did we keep his memory alive? Well, it was very difficult at first. We wanted, because of Karina, it was very difficult because every time she saw the picture of him on the wall, all she wanted to say was, "Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy?" And cry and cry and cry and cry. And so it was definitely, could have been very easy for us to take all the pictures down, don't mention him. And I mean, there were so many times that I might have been tempted to do that. But again, I think a lot of it too goes back to the two things. One, all these people who kept his memory so alive and still do. I mean, he's still alive in our minds and in our hearts, and he is alive. And second of all, I felt that it gave my children a strength. I think I wanted my children to never feel that they were missing something terrible. I mean, you see divorce situations and, the heartache and the children and problems. And I felt, no, my kids, they're going to know they have a father. He's on a mission. He's just not here now, but they have a father. And I wanted them, because the three younger ones were so young, to know what kind of father they have. And so, I mean, there were many things. We talked about him. You know, Dad did this, Dad did that. I mean, they would wear a Dad shirt. We'd use Dad scriptures. And when he'd highlighted one, oh, we got to highlight that one because that was a special one to Dad. You know, we saw the pictures. We saw the slides. We did the things that Dad did. We did the skiing. We went to the beach. We did all the stuff that I didn't want my kids ever to not be able to do the things that they would have done if Dad was here. And so I probably went overboard on a lot of that, but I was determined they were not going to lack, even though their dad, it was a big void in their lives. I was going to do the best to make them not feel that. Okay, on the 25th anniversary of Kyle's death, I really felt that I wanted to take the kids to Catalina, and so we did the Catalina trip, and also I got this little monument stone that I happened to see in a catalog, and it just really seemed to say, in essence, a lot about this experience so far, which is if tears could build a stairway and memory a lane, I'd walk right up to heaven and bring you home again.